So as I begin recording this video, it kind of occurs to me that I pretty much start out all these videos the exact same way, by expressing how much I love playing video games. And you know what? I just can't help it, because I really do love playing video games.
I love them, I don't care who knows it.
And I'm sure that if you're watching this video, then you probably love playing video games too. So you can relate to that wonderful feeling of when you discover an awesome new video game. You know, it's kind of like going on a first date. You get excited, you get lost in another world, and the next thing you know, you're happily married with 3 kids.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
But you know what kind of sucks? Is when it seems like you're the only person who's really into this awesome new game that you've discovered. It's a bit jarring when you can't find a single person that knows, cares, or has any interest in this game that you think is great. And you're either left wondering if you're the weirdo, pondering your gaming choices, or you start acting like those bitter Horizon fans who hate on Breath of the Wild for being a much better game and overshadowing the game that you like. We all have those games that we thought were great, but just didn't get the attention that we felt they deserved. So these are what I feel are the top 10 most underrated video games. The first game on my list also happens to be the most recent, because I cannot think of a game within the past few years that has been more criminally underrated than Titanfall 2. Titanfall 2 is by far one of the best shooters I have ever played, and it is certainly my favorite from this generation. Yes, I like it better than Call of Duty, I like it better than Battlefield, and I even like it better than Overwatch. There are some games that I will never forget because I will never forget how the game made me feel. For example, I will never forget the first time I crossed the Dark Portal in World of Warcraft. I will never forget the first time I fought a dragon in Skyrim. And I will never forget parkouring around a giant city trying to avoid the destructive force of giant mechs fighting one another. Not to mention the satisfaction of taking down one of those mechs by hand.
Bring that Titan down. Titan down.
The gunplay in Titanfall 2 was as solid as any game I've ever played, and the parkouring and giant mechs added a level of excitement that I hadn't experienced in any other shooter. And even if multiplayer wasn't really your thing, the game had a campaign that was met with high praise from most of the players that experienced it. Unfortunately, the number of those players was a lot smaller than it probably should have been. And it's a real shame too. But what do you expect when Titanfall 2's release date was wedged between Battlefield and Call of Duty, the two biggest franchises in the genre? EA literally hamstrung their own game with poor marketing decisions, which seems to have become one of their most defining qualities as a game publisher. And the game wasn't perfect either. At launch, it was plagued with numerous balancing issues, which soured first impressions. And because of this, Titanfall 2 was never really able to compete with the bigger titles. These days, if there's a sale happening, you can often pick up Titanfall 2 for under $10, which is a steal. In hindsight, it makes sense that a fairly underrated movie would one day become an underrated video game. Way back before Rockstar became known as the company that only made Red Dead Redemption and Grand Theft Auto games, they did a little bit more. For one, they made Bully, which was fairly underrated in its own right. But even more so, at least in my opinion, was the video game adaptation of the cult classic film The Warriors. For one, the game expands upon the story and its characters, starting off as a prequel to the events of the movie. You're able to learn more about each member of the Warriors, their setting, and their beef with the rival gangs. The game borrows a tad bit from Grand Theft Auto with certain things, like being able to make money by stealing, but gameplay-wise it's more like an arcade beat-em-up. A really fun arcade beat-em-up.
This kid learns quick. He's got some moves.
Come on, partner.
And this style of gameplay allowed for couch co-op through the campaign, which only added to the fun. Not to mention Rumble Mode, which added some really fun multiplayer games, like allowing players to pick a gang and then fight each other in an all-out brawl. Much fun can be had in this mode alone. I had never actually seen the movie The Warriors until after I played the game. Because I enjoyed the game so much, I watched the movie, and now the movie has become one of my classic favorites. So even if you've never seen the movie, you just might enjoy the game. Fortunately, the game is still being sold digitally on the PlayStation 4. In fact, I might just have to fire mine up and bop my way back to Coney.
Can you dig it?
Recently, I made a video where I discussed what I felt were the top 10 games that I had never played, and on that list was Yoshi's Island. Well, since making that video, I've actually played through Yoshi's Island, and it turns out I was correct. It is by far one of the best games that I had never played. The fact that I went through my entire childhood without playing through Yoshi's Island is a tragedy. In fact, as some sort of weird cosmic justice, I just might have to make my future kids play through the game.
You will do it, and you will like it. Come on.
What can I say? I just want better for my kids. The game is as charming as it is challenging. The music is memorable, the levels are fun with tons of hidden secrets, and the boss battles are extremely creative, especially the last one. As a platformer, it is by far one of the best, and I know some people were a little turned off by the Baby Mario aspect, but I actually think that works out really well. There's nothing that induces panic more, at least not in me, than a crying baby, and whenever I get hit and I suddenly hear Mario crying, I know I need to rescue him as quickly as possible, and that's exactly what the game wants you to do. So yes, it might be annoying to some, but I actually found it to be a really unique and effective health mechanic. And staying up well past 4 in the morning, taking on the terrifying giant baby Bowser, and finishing the game really took me back to my younger days as a gamer, and it was a fulfilling experience to say the least. Yoshi's Island is by far one of the best classic games out there, and I'm glad to see that it's getting some of the recognition that it deserves thanks to the internet. But I can't help but feel like the game is still somewhat underrated. I mean, the fact that there have been several Yoshi games made since then that are rarely ever talked about is kinda sad really. I'm playing through Yoshi's Woolly World now on the Wii U, and it's lots of fun and incredibly adorable. I sincerely hope that Yoshi's Crafted World on the Switch will get more attention, and more people will come to appreciate the Yoshi games, because I feel like as a whole, this franchise is certainly underrated. Speaking of adorable games, let's talk about Kirby for a minute. He's had a lot of great games over the years, but on the Wii, he did something a little weird. He became a piece of yarn. Now hear me out, I know it's weird, but Kirby's Epic Yarn is actually really good. It's as legitimate of a Kirby game as any other Kirby game. Yes, the art is incredibly adorable, but it's also extremely creative with how it's implemented and utilized. Yes, the game does abandon Kirby's trademark ability to eat enemies and steal their powers, but that's traded off for new yarn powers. It sounds a little weird, but it's actually a lot of fun, and it's very much a Kirby experience. It's actually a fairly laid-back game experience, and that may not appeal to everyone, but I really enjoy it, and I think there's a place for these kinds of games. It allows me to casually explore a world with my wife because the game has local co-op. I don't necessarily agree that Kirby's Epic Yarn is super easy, at least not on the standards of it being a Kirby game. I mean, every Kirby game pretty much has been designed to be a breeze to get through, but with Kirby, you get out what you put in, and if you actually try to 100% the game, it becomes a lot more challenging. And that's why I think Kirby's Epic Yarn is highly underrated. People take one look at it and say, oh, it's a dumb kids game, but it's a lot more than that. It's highly creative and extremely challenging, and I definitely recommend it. To be honest, I've always been a fan of the Mario sports games throughout the years, but I'll admit that a lot of those games were a bit Fisher-Price. But in my opinion, there is one set of games that stands out above the rest, and that is the Mario Strikers series. More specifically, Mario Strikers Charged for the Wii. I think that if there's one thing that video games are proving, it's that you can pretty much mix soccer with anything and it's going to be fun. Soccer plus cars equals lots of fun. Soccer plus Mario equals lots of fun. The thing about this game is that it's weirdly intense for a Mario game. I mean, just look at Mario here. The dude's more laid back when he's actually saving Princess Peach's life. I mean, yes, the game is technically a soccer game, but there will be power-ups flying all over the field, and you'll pretty much be tackling everyone in sight. Not to mention that the court itself is surrounded by an electrical fence. Jesus. And if you're on offense, you'll be spending most of your time passing the ball around trying to set up that perfect shot, which is usually very satisfying. As is expected, the game is at its best when you are playing with someone else, not only because the AI programming leaves something to be desired, but also because playing with someone else usually adds to the intensity and the excitement. I mean, the last time my wife and I played this game together, we spent the entire game laughing uncontrollably at just how ridiculous and over the top the game actually is. So if you're like many others who just assumed that Mario Strikers Charged was just like every other mediocre Mario sports game, think again. And if you ever have the chance to play this game, I highly recommend that you give it a try. With Kirby's Epic Yarn, we discussed the mistake that some gamers make when looking at a game with more cartoony graphics and assuming that the game will be uninteresting. And I feel that many gamers made this mistake when looking at the Viva Pinata series. Both Viva Pinata and its sequel, Trouble in Paradise, have very cartoony, stylized graphics. In spite of this, the games themselves are extremely challenging and have a great deal of depth. You take on the role of a gardener, and your goal is to build a garden that attracts pinatas. If they like what you've done with the place, they'll actually want to move in and live in your garden. Once they've moved in, you can start breeding them, which leads to a really fun mini-game that becomes progressively harder with each new species of pinata. The goal is to attract new pinatas to your garden and raise them. Some pinatas will want to eat crops, and some will want to eat other pinatas. The game starts off very slow and easy, but as you attract more and more pinatas, the game becomes far more challenging, and there is a lot more to manage. The presentation of the game is very charming, and even the most disturbing aspects, like the food chain, are presented in the most adorable way possible. Of all the garbage that Rare has had to shovel out from Microsoft over the years, Viva Pinata stands above it all, as being one of the last great testaments to the magic that was once Rareware. In spite of the favorable reviews the games received, the Dark Cloud series was fairly obscure. To be honest, I don't know how I stumbled across Dark Cloud back in the day. Probably just a random used game I picked up at GameStop or something. But I'm glad I did, because it's still one of my favorite games on the PlayStation 2. If there's one word I could use to describe the Dark Cloud series, it's innovative. I mean, I guess there wasn't a lot of nuance to the mechanics themselves even back then, but it's the way the games brought mechanics together from other games to make something unique and interesting. In the first game, you go from place to rebuild the towns that once stood there. The towns and the citizens have been sealed away in spheres called Atla. So the first thing that you have to do is enter the dungeons to find the Atla. Each floor of the dungeon is randomly generated, with enemies, treasure chests, and Atla scattered throughout. The combat system is very simple, with a lock-on mechanic similar to Zelda. On top of that, each floor has a map and a compass. So as you make your way through the dungeon and retrieve the Atla, you can begin rebuilding the village. This leads to a building mechanic similar to SimCity. The game also has survival mechanics, where you have to eat and drink to stay alive, and if you don't repair your weapon, it could break and disappear forever, which is extremely punishing considering you have to level up your weapons in order for them to become more powerful. So as you can see, there are tons of different mechanics mixed in here, and I feel they work together pretty well. Personally, I prefer the simplicity of Dark Cloud 1, but objectively speaking, I would say that Dark Cloud 2 is probably a better game. The second game virtually improves on every aspect of the first game and even adds a ton more new mechanics to the game. It's a great deal more complicated, but overall it's still a really good experience. I love both the Dark Cloud games, and I think a lot more people would have enjoyed them as well had they been more easily discoverable. My hope that there will one day be a Dark Cloud 3, it'll be bigger and better than ever, and the series will finally get the attention that it deserves. If you look up the word underrated in the dictionary, there should be a picture of the GameCube underneath it. The GameCube will go down as one of the saddest stories in all of gaming, an underrated console that produced a ton of underrated games. Fortunately, as time has gone on, a lot of these games have gotten the attention they deserve, like Super Mario Sunshine and The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. But if there's one game on that console that I feel is still being overlooked, it's Luigi's Mansion. Poor Luigi. That guy can never catch a break. Luigi's Mansion was the first game from the Mario franchise to be released on the GameCube, and I think therein lies the problem. It was a new console and a new generation, and people were wanting a Mario 64 style game for that generation, and what they got was Luigi as a Ghostbuster. I mean, yeah, you're comparing apples to oranges, but the problem is, at the time, people were really wanting apples. But that doesn't change the fact that Luigi's Mansion is still a really tasty orange. For starters, the game really helped to establish Luigi as a character of his own. I mean, I can still hear Luigi fearfully humming along to the Mansion theme to this day. The thing about Luigi's Mansion is that I really can't think of anything to compare it to. It's a unique animal. For one, even though it's a Mario game, it's not a platformer. It's an action-adventure exploration game with puzzle-solving elements. It really is a lot of fun, and I'm so glad that unlike other games on this list, at least Luigi's Mansion is confirmed to be getting a sequel on the Switch. I can't wait for that game. Look, I don't mean to be divisive here. This is just my opinion. An opinion that happens to be shared by a lot of people actually, like most people, but while the 2D Sonic games were pretty good, most of the 3D Sonic games were really bad. It amazes me that it's been so many years of 3D Sonic games being made, and they've tried to reinvent the wheel so many times, and more often than not, they fall flat on their faces, and yet we still get new Sonic games that always manage to surprise us with how terrible they are. It boggles the mind. But believe it or not, there is one 3D Sonic game that I actually feel is pretty decent, and because it's surrounded by all those other crappy ones, it's kind of underrated. I'm talking about Sonic Generations. This is, in my opinion, one of the few good Sonic games that's been made in like the past 2 decades. I mean, yes, the game does have nostalgia on its side for sure, and it does mix in some 2D and 3D levels, but it also addresses most of the complaints people have with other Sonic games. For one, there's no incredibly stupid, mind-numbing plotline in the game. And two, this game is the answer to all those people that say if the game only had Sonic in it, it would be fine. That's kind of true here. You don't have any dumb Knuckles stages, you don't have Big the Cat, none of that crap that people don't want to do. It's just you playing as Sonic, and that's what makes it work. On top of that, there are some pretty fun boss fights mixed throughout the game. I mean, yeah, maybe it is a glorified nostalgia trip, but it's still better than whatever they were tripping on when they made all those other crappy Sonic games. I I feel like the most underrated game franchise of all time would have to be Nintendo's Punch-Out series. It's weird because between the first Punch-Out game on console with Mike Tyson and Little Mac being in Smash Bros, I feel like people are very aware of the Punch-Out series, and yet I still feel like it's heavily underrated. Well, maybe not Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. I mean, pretty much everybody played that game and just about everybody loves that game. I know so many people that still remember the Mike Tyson passcode. But then we move on to Super Punch-Out, and this is where things started to take a turn. I feel like most people know this game existed, but never actually played it, and I'm one of those people. Up until last year, I never really gave this game much of a try. Super Punch-Out is very different from the first game, both in presentation and in gameplay. It's actually a lot more like the original arcade game. The thing is, the game is still a lot of fun, and it captures the essence of what Punch-Out is. It's still about memorizing patterns and quick reactions. But this game seems to want to encourage you to beat your opponent as quickly as possible, and there are hidden mechanics in each fight to help you do this. And this adds a lot more depth to the game. I think the presentation is what really hurt this game. I mean, the fighters are a lot less memorable, the music is generic SNES rock, and even Little Mac himself looks a lot more generic now with his blonde hair. And that brings us to Punch-Out on the Wii, which I feel is the best game in the series and probably one of my favorite games of all time. The animation in this game is enough to put it on the map, both in the way that it brings the fighters to life and the way that it's creatively used as a key to the player's success in each and every fight. Each fighter is unique and very likable, especially Piston Hondo. Even though that most people who have played it say that Punch-Out is a good game, I feel like it's even better than that. I feel like Punch-Out is a great game. Of all the deluxes and DXs and remakes coming out on the Switch, I would be A-OK with Punch-Out Deluxe. Bring that baby to the Switch, please. And while I love seeing Little Mac in Smash Bros, I can only hope that I will one day see him re-enter the boxing ring. And those are what I feel are 10 of the most underrated video games. But I would love to hear what you guys think. Do you like any of these games? And what are some games that you think are underrated that I didn't mention in this video? Feel free to let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and if you'd like, you can support this channel on Patreon. Links to all of this can be found in the description below. This is Kephas. Until next time.